găsit! Rusia a pornit un război pe scară largă împotriva Ucrainei, pe care vestul nu îl mai credea posibil. Putin ne spune că a declanșat un război împotriva naziștilor, ereticilor, globaliștilor, homosexualilor, că este lupta între bine și rău, apocalipsa. În urmă cu 6 decenii, profesorul american Hofstadter dezvolta teoria privind comportamentul paranoid al politicienilor care susțin acest tip de discurs. Astăzi se vorbește de tulburare de personalitate paranoidă. Dar este Putin paranoic sau un lider abil? Este frustrat, dement, bolnav sau doar un dictator care îl are ca model pe Stalin? Invitatul meu este unul dintre cei mai buni cunoscători ai Rusiei lui Putin, profesorul Mark Galeotti. Domnul Galeotti este profesor de onoare la University College London, a predat istorie la Robinson College, Cambridge, a fost șeful departamentului de istorie la Universitatea Kiel, profesor de afaceri internaționale la Universitatea din New York, profesor invitat la Universitatea Carolină din Praga și la Institutul de Stat pentru Relații Internaționale al Ministerului Afacerilor Externe al Federației Ruse. A consiliat mai multe instituții, printre care Comitetul pentru Afaceri Externe din Camera Comunelor, Adunarea Parlamentară a NATO, Interpolul și Comandamentul Suprem al Forțelor Aliate din Europa. Domnul Galeotti este o autoritate în politica, securitatea și serviciile de informații ale Federației Ruse. Recent, la editura Corinta a apărut Vorui, Asațini și hoți, super mafia rusă, care îl are ca autor. Professor Galeotti, thank you so much for accepting this interview. I propose to talk about the war waged by Russia against Ukraine, about the information and political war against the West, and about the Siloviki, the Russian super mafia, and of course about Vladimir Putin. Did Putin really believe that the Russian army would have an easy, quick victory, that the Ukrainians will greet the Russian soldiers with flowers and Zelensky will flee? Was Putin misinformed? Did he fail to his own maskirovka?
First of all, did believe most of that. Whether he thought that the Russians would be welcomed as liberators, really, I think it's more likely that, remember, this is a man who doesn't think Ukraine really exists as a country. He doesn't think the Ukrainians are a real people. I think he genuinely thought that the whole state structure would collapse at the first gentle push. And so absolutely he could have Zelensky arrested, or Zelensky would flee, and he could impose some proxy government of his own. Was he misinformed? Well, yes, he was misinformed, but because he had created a system whose job is to misinform him. I mean, we've known this for years, that increasingly Putin has become intolerant of anyone who questions his prejudices, his assumptions. So yes, you surround yourself with yes men. You shouldn't be surprised when people tell you that your plan is brilliant and that it couldn't possibly fail and so forth. So he was misinformed, but for his own, really for his own reasons, shall we say. And now, again, the interesting question is how much he's been even told now about what's really going on.
How do you see the war going on? Will it be like a new Chechnya war or a new Afghanistan? Will it be a guerrilla war or an attrition war? What do you think?
I think, unfortunately, we are heading into a war of attrition. I think when it comes down to it, is even with the Western assistance that the Ukrainians have been provided, and let's be honest, also their astonishingly impressive will to defend their own nation, the Ukrainians and the Russians are both too strong to be beaten, but too weak to actually win the war militarily. And so I think we're probably heading for a long-term war of attrition in essentially the Donbass. And it will ultimately come down to at what point does one side or the other feel willing to sue for peace, but I think we're nowhere near there. I think unfortunately we have to accept this is going to go for months into next year, quite possibly. And bit by bit, both countries are going to have to adapt and become war-fighting countries. I mean, interesting that already, for example, Zelensky is in some ways saying that Ukraine will have to become like Israel. And likewise, Putin is in many ways turning Russia into really one big military machine in which there's no room for anything other than loyal patriots who follow the Kremlin line. So unfortunately, I would love to think that there'll be some way in which this war could be ended positively, whether it's through some kind of Ukrainian victory or whether it's through some kind of peace deal. But I don't think we're anywhere near there.
But getting back to Maskirovka, the Russian army proved to have bad tactics, strategies, not so well equipped, not so the great Russian army that we were told that. So do you think that Putin don't see that now?
I think that on the one hand, look, it's certainly true that a lot of flaws within the Russian military came to light. Remember, they haven't fought a big war like this for a long time. Something like Syria, very small intervention, they could send their best and such like. This is a major land war. And what I think it really demonstrated was that this is classic, and it goes back to Soviet times, flaw, that they concentrate on the teeth, on the tanks and the guns, rather than the tail. In other words, the logistics, making sure there's enough ammunition, that there's hot food for the soldiers, that the soldiers are properly trained, all this kind of stuff. So yes, there are some serious flaws within the Russian military, but I think at the same time, it's to a large extent because of Putin's own strategy. The Russian military is geared to fight in a certain way, and it's not the way that they ended up fighting in Ukraine. I mean, if it had been the generals' war, they would have built up a massive sort of base of logistics beforehand. They're very, very methodical about that. Then they would have launched a huge air attack across Ukraine. I mean, nothing like the sort of attacks we've seen, but a devastating initial attack to try and basically ensure that every Ukrainian plane is blown out of the sky or destroyed on its airfield, that every Ukrainian barracks gets bombed. I mean, that's what they prepare for. And then there would have been a slow, methodical grind. That's how the Russians fight. It's not about a kind of heroic initial dash. It's about a slow fight. We didn't see any of that. We saw this decision to be made to fight pretty much on the spur of the moment. Many generals didn't know more than a week before that they were going to go into Ukraine. I mean, we know that from intercepted communications. That was a disastrous mistake. We saw a kind of fairly half-hearted initial bombardment. Again, because I think Putin thought the country was going to fall into his lap. Why destroy things that you think are about to become yours? And then we saw this bizarre spectacle of little units of paratroopers trying to rush their way into Kyiv, as if they honestly thought they could just simply drive in there and arrest Zelensky.
It was the FSB special division? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's a variety. There were paratroopers, there were FSB, there were some Chechens, there were the Wagner mercenaries. I mean, but the main thing was, this was a war that was not created by the generals. It was created by the people like the FSB and people like Putin, who have no military experience, but somehow thought that they could plan a war. Putin ultimately has been the Ukrainian secret weapon all along, it turns out.
What about the corruption in the army? I mean, this is maybe the main reason for the fall of the Russian army?
Exactly. Corruption's a massive problem. We've known that, the Russians have known that for years, decades, and haven't really done anything about it. But again, you see, the way that the Russians are plan to fight wars would usually mean that they almost account for that. They know there will be a lot of corruption. They will know there will be a lot of machinery that won't work and such like. So they tend to overstock.
This corruption is their corruption.
Exactly. So they factor it in. But again, they couldn't in this short period. And so absolutely, we saw trucks with cheap tires from China that just shredded as soon as they were used. We've seen bombs and missiles that fail to explode. I mean, this has been a ridiculous spectacle for a country that tries to present itself as one of the great global powers. And again, when it comes down to it, this is the system over which Putin has presided for 22 years. He was so keen on building up his military. And what it turns out that means is he wants to buy fancy new tanks and things, but he's not actually interested in the real detail. There is this old adage that amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. It's all the boring stuff, the things that Putin's never interested in attending, which really has been what has undermined the Russian war effort.
There is a lot of talk about Putin's illness, about the 8-9 doctors who accompany him every year, about the self-isolation imposed during the pandemic, about his phobias, but also about Russian generals who would plot a coup. How much truth is here? And if Putin disappears, what will happen next? Does the West really believe that Putin's disappearance will bring democracy in Russia?
First of all, on Putin's health. Look, I mean, I've been watching this man since before he was president, so what, 24, 25 years. And look, I'm not a medical doctor, but it certainly seems to be the case that there is something wrong with him. In terms of, we see, and this is a man who always presented himself outwardly as absolutely in control of his country, but also in control of himself, his emotions, his body, and so forth. And we've seen instead the uncontrollable twitches. We've seen that even when he talks, he's clearly much more sort of hesitant at times. We've seen these explosions of anger, which again were very uncharacteristic. So there is something. Some people say it's Parkinson's disease. Some people say it's various forms of cancer, that he's taking steroids. I don't know. But there is something there. And that is clearly affecting his political position and his decision-making. That said, what we don't know is whether this is something that will be with him for the next decade, or whether in 2 weeks' time he's going to not wake up. We'll have to wait and see. But the interesting thing is precisely that actually the discussion about his illness is destabilizing. His health has always been a taboo issue. I mean, we've known for a long time, for example, that he has back problems. But every time that he seems to flare up for him, he just disappears from view for a couple of weeks. No one actually ever admits that it's because he's too ill. No, he's always got to be in perfect health. So he might go soon, but even if he doesn't, it undermines his position. Now, obviously, if he goes quickly, then the elite will have to decide how to replace him. And I think that's at least as likely as the fact of some kind of a coup. The Russian system is very, very carefully designed to make coups difficult. There are a whole variety of different security agencies and military forces that are all there to kind of watch each other and counterbalance each other. Even if you look at the geography of power in Moscow, there are 2 army divisions. There is 1 division from the National Guard, which is a separate force. Then there's also the Kremlin Guard, which is yet another force. Then there are the armed police. Then there's the FSB and its commando units. You know, all of these are there to ensure that no one agency can easily take power. And there is an extraordinary paranoia that currently reigns within the Russian elite. I'm sure there's a lot of people who would be very happy if Putin could be toppled, but they want someone else to do it. No one wants to be the first person to start that conversation when you don't know, is your telephone being tapped? Are your emails being read? Is the person you're going to talk to actually an informant for one of the intelligence agencies? So I think it's going to be very difficult until the situation gets much worse. I think this is something that we shouldn't expect to happen soon. But later in the year, as the economic crisis really begins to bite, as Putin's health potentially becomes more of a concern, that's when it begins to become a possibility. Because remember, this is an elite that is made up of people who are selfish, pragmatic opportunists. They're not Putinists. They don't feel any kind of great ideological tie. And so the day when they think supporting the boss is more dangerous than conspiring against the boss is the day when they'll shift, but we're not there yet. But on your final point, what happens next? I mean, I don't think we're going to see another Putin. If nothing else, I don't think any of the current figures within the elite would want to make one of their number the absolute and unchallenged boss the way Putin is today. And there's no obvious candidate to replace him. 3 months ago, I'd have said the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. But obviously, since the war, his star has become rather tarnished. So I think what we're going to get is some kind of oligarchy. We're going to get a collection of powerful figures that sort of divide up power amongst themselves. And the president might even be some kind of figurehead who's not really got power, but is just there to play the part. And is this going to mean democracy? No. These people are kleptocrats. They are going to control the country to their own advantage. But on the other hand, they probably will want to improve relations with the West, simply because they like the old times when they could steal at home and bank and spend abroad. They want to buy and keep their nice apartment blocks in London. They want to be able to moor their yachts off the coasts of France or Italy and send their kids to universities in the West and that kind of thing. So for the most selfish reasons, while they'll probably continue to be authoritarian, corrupt, and quite brutal at home, they nonetheless will probably want to improve relations with the West, which could be a good thing for Ukraine.
The West is trying to understand Putin's Russia. You have proposed some explanation. Loyalty, vertical power, secret agreements between the Russian super mafia and the Siloviki. How does these poniati, the unspoken agreements between Russian super mafia and Siloviki work? How you see this unique agreement in the world?
It is unique. And I think the thing is, what we've got to understand is people often want to sort of say well, who's in charge? Does the Kremlin control the mafia, or does the mafia control the Kremlin, or whatever? That's not how Russia works. Russia works much more about a whole variety of interest groups and power groups, some of which are open and well known about, like the Siloviki, the security apparatus, or big business, or the other friends of Putin and so forth, and others of which, like the Voriva and the more modern criminals, sort of the various criminal groupings, are obviously in the underworld. But in a way, they all are part of the same broad economy of power, shall we say. It's all about deals and bargains. It's about what can you do for me and what price do you want for that. So, for example, we have seen that the criminals have been used as adjuncts to the Russian intelligence service abroad, carrying out assassinations, gathering intelligence, passing money on to political movements that the Kremlin would like to support. They don't do that because they're loyal Russians. They don't do that just out of the kindness of their heart. They do it because they've struck bargains with Moscow. And in return, they get freedom of maneuver to run their criminal businesses, to whatever it is, traffic in people or heroin or do whatever else. So it's this constant state of bargaining that we see within the Russian political system. And I think so long as the criminals have something to offer the Kremlin will be willing to give them that space for their activities.
We will get back to this topic and criminal political war against West, as you put it. But from Opricina to Cheka and Ghereu, the secret political police seems to be the backbone of Russia. Now, why has the Russian state preserved this kind of power for centuries? What in the Russian mentality does this type of obedience make possible? It is resignation, it is the willing of subordination to a great collective messianic ideal. It's specific to Russia?
Political police forces are not exactly unique to Russia, obviously. And in some ways, I would actually turn that whole suggestion you made round. Part of the reason why Russia's rulers have been so dependent on having powerful, over-powerful security services is precisely because actually the Russians are much, much less resigned to central rule than we often think. That actually that there is this constant fear of what the Russians call bunt, this explosion of violence from the people at the bottom against the people at the top. And in this huge country, which is intrinsically difficult to control, I mean, even today, modern Russia spans 12 time zones. And even in a day of internet and telephone and aircraft, it's very hard to control. And so I think time and time again what's happened is that despite all kinds of grand idealistic ideas that they were going to be able to get rid of them, whether it's czars, whether it's commissars, or whether it's the post-Soviet sort of quote-unquote democratic leaderships, when it comes down to it, the task of trying to control Russians, they decided that they needed these forces. It's a lot more easy and convenient than trying genuinely to win a true coalition of support from ordinary Russians. So time and time again, every time there's a crisis, it seems to be that the natural instinct of whoever is in charge is to turn to these Chekists, the secret policemen. And the problem is that we haven't yet had a proper break. Even when the 1917 revolution happened, actually many of the people who were really running the country for the Bolsheviks had been Tsarist officials. They had all the habits and mindsets of that. Then, when the Soviet Union collapsed, actually in Russia, unlike so many other countries, essentially the old elite took off their Communist Party pins and bought themselves brand new shiny suits and turned themselves into politicians and oligarchs and such like. But again, the attitudes were still there. So in some ways, it's really part of what I would say is Kremlin political culture, is that if in doubt, a secret police force is the only way you can know what's really going on in your own country. A secret police force is the only way you can really control the masses. And a secret police force is, perhaps most importantly of all, the only thing you can use to control your own elite. In a way, what you fear more than anything else, exactly go back to the question of coups, is the men with power, the men with guns. How can you control them? You need the men with secrets.
It's a wishful thinking for people in the West thinking that the generals are plotting, something like that.
If it's just the generals, you're absolutely right. But there have been two coups in the last 100 years. The ousting of Khrushchev and the 1991 August coup against Gorbachev, which was then sidelined by people power on the streets. The thing was, in both of those, it was actually a coalition of the elite. It was the party, it was the KGB, and it was the military together who combined. And again, going back to this point about the secret police, that's the whole point. You need to keep these different groups apart. So long as they're apart, you don't have to worry. When the military tried it on their own, they failed. But if the military ally with people in other groups, all of a sudden the autocrat, whoever they happen to be, is vulnerable. So that's the key to keeping Russia coup-proofed.
You said that the loyalty is the secret ingredient that keeps these forces together, is the bond that binds those who lead Russia. Putin demands loyalty and which he rewards with opportunities. Does this formula still work during the war?
That's a really interesting question, and I think this is really at the heart of why this system is becoming vulnerable. Because the answer is no. Again, the old Putin regime, it relied on, first of all, continuing huge amounts of money flowing into the country, not just, but especially because of oil and gas, but for a whole variety of different activities. And the opportunity for people to then convert that into a good quality of life. Now what we're seeing is, although at the moment, sort of temporarily and artificially, it looks as if Russia's economy is doing quite well in terms of exports of oil and gas, but in practice the economy is under pressure and will become even more under pressure. And it's becoming more and more isolated. Let's face it, if you are a rich Russian, you want to be able to go on holiday abroad. You're not thinking just Sochi every single time. Maybe you want to buy a Bentley or a Rolls Royce rather than a Chinese-made car. It sounds trivial, but it speaks to a wider issue, which is, in fact, what we're seeing is, as the economy comes under pressure more and more, a relative handful of people who are close to Putin, and therefore have the most political power, are protecting their own interests. But if the overall cake is shrinking, and their slice is being kept sort of the same, there's much, much less to go around. So I think actually the scope to keep everyone bought off, which is essentially what it's about, is becoming less. The ordinary people, ordinary masses, who once upon a time, in the first 2 terms of Putin's presidency, they were quite happy because their quality of life improved dramatically. They're dealing with massive inflation, increasing risks of unemployment and so forth. The middle-ranking elite, the people who really just run the country, they too are finding themselves under more and more economic pressure. So even if you've got a handful of friends who are still doing fine, everyone else is beginning to think, well, hang on, this was the deal. We turned a blind eye to the fact that there was no real democracy. We turned a blind eye to the fact that your friends were making huge amounts of money because we at least had a reasonable chance. But once that social contract is broken, then things can change quite quickly.
You wrote about Poniatie, the unspoken agreement that governed Putin's world. If you follow the unspoken laws, you have nothing to fear. When you break them, you become not an enemy, but a traitor. Does Putin punish traitors according to the laws of thieves in law, or according to the unwritten laws of the former KGB? One famously said that it cost you 1 ruble to get into the KGB and 2 to get out.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, unfortunately, there's been such a convergence between, shall we say, the laws of the criminals and the laws of the political police that it's sometimes very hard to tell the difference. No, I mean, Putin has made it clear what he thinks. I mean, Putin once said to sort of liberal radio host, enemies you fight with, but there's a chance that you'll someday make a peace deal with them. Traitors, you can do nothing with them but wipe them out. And I think that is essentially his philosophy. And that helps explain some of the brutality that we're seeing in Ukraine. I mean, again, in Putin's mind, Ukrainians are really Russians who don't quite realize it. For them to fight against Russia is almost actually an act of treason on their part. So whether we're talking about the poisoning of Navalny or the poisoning and attempted poisoning of defectors in London, or whether we're talking about how the Chechens were treated during the Second Chechen War, or whether we're talking about Ukrainians now, if he feels that you're not just an enemy but a traitor, then in a way your life is entirely forfeit.
You wrote about how the Kremlin used Russians mafia around the world, citing the example of Crimea, Donbass or Transnistria, or the case of the Sochi Winter Olympics, the most expensive in history, 55 billion, which half was embezzled through corruption, or Belarus, where new smuggling routes have emerged after sanctions were imposed on Russia. Did the war in Ukraine bring new business opportunities for the Russian super mafia and the Russian kleptocracy?
As ever, I mean, it's closed some doors but opened others. One thing that was very striking in the past was that actually Russian criminals and Ukrainian criminals worked perfectly comfortably together. Their countries might have been an undeclared war, but the gangsters were the true internationalists and made money. So we saw huge amounts of flows of all kinds of criminal commodities, counterfeit goods, heroin, people and so forth, through Russia, through Ukraine and into Europe. Now clearly that's a very different situation now. I mean, because you can't really move goods through Ukraine, and to deal with the Russians now for a Ukrainian criminal is not just probably difficult for them to actually get their head around, but it's also something that's much more likely to get the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Service, coming after you. So that has pretty much been closed off. I mean, I'm sure there is still a little bit of smuggling going on, but at the moment at least, that's stopped. So there are routes that are closed. But there's also things that become more new opportunities that are created. Some of these are trivial. I mean, for example, things like luxury goods for very rich Russians. I was hearing one case of a whole collection of Italian luxury handbags that were being smuggled, because that's now sort of banned, and presumably oligarchs' girlfriends still need to have their handbags. Now that's just a fairly sort of trivial example. On the large level, one of the key issues of the sanctions has been actually how it limits Russians' capacity to move money around the world. Russian money has become toxic, and clearly they are looking for new money launderers. And I think what we're already beginning to see is that there are some existing ones through banking system in Dubai, in Macau, in mainland China and such like, that were once used essentially just by the criminals. And now there's at least a suggestion, and it's too early to be really sure about this, but there's a suggestion that there might also be state money that is also being laundered through these routes. So in other words, the state is now essentially asking the Russian gangsters to launder its money so that it can do things. So I think this is it. I mean, I think actually one possibility, and I would no more put it than that, is that actually one effect of this war is that it makes the Kremlin increasingly want to nationalize organized crime. And the example would be North Korea. North Korea has an institution called Bureau 39 that is, in effect, the North Korean Ministry of Crime. that it produces amphetamine, it forges $100 bills, it does all kinds of other things to bring money in for the state. I could see some people in Moscow thinking, that's actually not a bad idea. Let's see if we can do something here. So that's something that we need to keep an eye out, because that would be a true fusion of Russian gangsterdom and Russian secret policing and officialdom. That would be a very dangerous threat.
You wrote about how dirty money is laundering abroad, for example, in Moldova and then in countries like Cyprus, Israel and Latvia, where the Russians have front companies and after that they wash it in United States or United Kingdom. This is not only mafia's money, but also oligarchs' money and the Kremlin elite. What impact do you think that the international sanctions have on this money?
I think actually it's rather more effective than we might assume. The one thing that sanctions regimes can do is precisely track individuals' money very effectively. I mean, we saw this after the September 11th terrorist attacks, when the Americans moved very quickly to target Al-Qaeda money. And again, essentially make laundering that particular type of money very, very dangerous for all the existing money launderers, which meant that basically people didn't want to do business with them. We're beginning to see that with the Russians as well, actually. That, a lot of the people who launder money, they launder money from all kinds of different directions. So they launder some Russian money and some Nigerian money and maybe even some American money and whatever. They have businesses that are bigger than any one income stream. And I think for a lot of them, they're beginning to think, actually handling Russian money is not good business anymore. So yes, maybe there clearly are front companies in Moldova, let's say. But then what? Then you have to move the money from there. And once you start moving to other places like Israel and Cyprus, you're beginning to face much more of a pushback there. I mean, in some ways it's become a problem, because ordinary Russians abroad, people who left Russia, maybe left Russia years ago, but just because they have a Russian name and a Russian nationality, they're suddenly finding that they can't open bank accounts and so forth. So there are a lot of victims of this. But on the other hand, it actually is, I think, beginning to affect the oligarchs' capacity to move money. But the main thing is, what can they do with that money? They can move it around. They can move it from this jurisdiction to that. But spending money, that's the real problem for them. Actually taking that money and buying an asset that is in any way going to be connected to them, that they're going to enjoy, whether it's a villa or whether it's a yacht or whether it's a company. That's when the real problem comes in. So I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of the oligarchs really are finding themselves now, if they didn't get out of Russia in time, they're increasingly now stuck in Russia, and they're watching their money move around the world, but never really able to land anywhere, they can never do anything with.
You said that Russian organized crime is one of the strongest transnational movements. It operates globally in arms, drug and human trafficking. And it has spread all over the world, especially in countries where there are Russian communities. It is a colonization, you said, a new Russian imperialism. What is this criminal political war that you said that Russia is waging against the West? How dangerous it is?
I mean, it is dangerous and it isn't, which is a very unsatisfying answer, but let me try and explain what I mean by that. It's not in the sense of, it's not going to pose some kind of existential threat to us in the West. But what it does do is it provides Moscow with a new range of instruments and tools.
But
that they have used.
Forgive me, 6 years ago they tried a coup in Montenegro. It failed, but I mean, they want to prevent the access of this country to NATO.
Sure. No, I mean, they have options, but again, if one looks at that coup, the key thing there was it was not just simply gangsters. It was also GRU military intelligence officers. It was also oligarchs. Again, the gangsters represent one of the sort of the tools in the toolbox. And I think what we've seen is, because we have seen criminals being used for all kinds of different sort of purposes, the more we push back on Russian intelligence activity, I mean, for example, Romania had 10 diplomats expelled because precisely of pushing out Russian spies from here. And that's something that we're seeing all around the West. It's harder and harder for the Russians to operate their conventional intelligence operations. But they still want to do things. They still want to gather information. They still want to put pressure on people. Well, if they can't use their spies, they'll be thinking, well, who else have we got at our disposal? And therefore, I think one of the risks we face is precisely that the Russians will increasingly turn to organized crime as a kind of, substitute. Because the more that they can't use their spies, the more they will depend on others. And sometimes the gangsters are incompetent and amateurish. Sometimes they're anything but. But the main thing is they're a lot harder for us to track, because in some ways they don't work out of embassies, they don't follow a sort of a standard career path. They may not even be Russians, because I think one of the key concerns is we're beginning to see subcontracting. That let's say the Russian state talks to Russian gangsters and says, for example, there have been cases of intelligence gathering in the Baltic states and Poland. They want to gather certain forms of intelligence, but they know that Russians can't loiter around army bases and things without sort of potential for trouble. So what happens is, because these Russians deal with local gangsters, they ask the local gangsters to do it. And they don't say why. They don't say, well, the Kremlin asked us. But the point is, so now you have Poles spying on Poles, or Baltic citizens spying on Baltic citizens, as part of a scheme that ultimately goes back to the Kremlin. But quite a lot of people in this system don't even know what they're doing. They don't even know why they're doing it, rather. So I think this is one of the concerns, that it allows the Russians to make up for the capacity that we're trying to force out of the West with all these expulsions of spies and rolling up of intelligence networks.
You wrote that Putin is concerned today with his historical legacy, not with the daily matters, but the big things, the war, for instance. How do you think that Putin will remain in history? The one who brought Crimea back to Russia, or the one who annexed it, like Hitler, Austria? The one who fought for the return of Russia as a global actor, or the one who established a fake democracy? A promoter of traditional values, the third Rome, or the sponsor of political assassination in Russia and Europe? An archangel fighting the evil, or just a war criminal?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's going to be that last one, a war criminal, and perhaps most gallingly for Putin of all, a failure. This is it. Ukraine was, I suspect, going to be, in his mind, his crowning triumph. He'd already, in some ways, brought Belarus into Russia's sphere of influence, because Lukashenko is now essentially dependent on Moscow. And now he was going to bring Ukraine in, and that was going to bring the full family, shall we say, of the Russian nations together under Moscow. I think that was probably, as he saw it, what was going to be the essence of the chapter in the history books about him. As is, though, this war has basically destroyed not just the reputation, but the capacity of the Russian military. It's shattering the Russian economy. It's creating new tensions, which will ultimately sort of define how his regime falls. Freudian slip there. And more to the point, exactly, it's demonstrated his own weaknesses as a strategist and a leader. This is a man who, if he had retired after his first 2 terms in office, would have probably had a pretty decent reputation as a heavy-handed and brutal, but nonetheless effective state builder. What he's now done, though, is he has squandered everything he brought to Russia, and a lot more. So ultimately, yeah, it will be as a failure and as a war criminal.
Professor Galeotti, thank you so much indeed.
My pleasure.
Astăzi, războaiele se dau nu numai în lumea reală, ci și în cea virtuală. Iar armatele de troli luptă pentru mințile oamenilor. Tatiana Țarfulea ne explică.
La începutul lunii mai, guvernul britanic dădea publicității un raport potrivit căruia Rusia folosește o așa numită fabrică de troli pentru a-și răspândi propaganda. Studiul comandat și finanțat de Marea Britanie dezvăluie modul în care fabrica de troli amplifică minciuni pe rețelele sociale, dar și în secțiunile de comentarii ale site-urilor de știri renumite și cu audiență mare. Aceștia urmăresc lideri occidentali și transmit propaganda Kremlinului cu privire la Ucraina și războiul din această țară. Printre liderii vizați se numără premierul britanic Boris Johnson, cancelarul german Olaf Scholz sau șeful diplomației europene, Josep Borrell. Nu putem permite Kremlinului și fermelor sale umbroase de troli să ne invadeze spațiile online cu minciunile lor despre războiul ilegal al lui Putin. Guvernul Regatului Unit a alertat partenerii internaționali și va continua să lucreze îndeaproape cu aliații și platformele media pentru a submina operațiunile de informare rusești, a spus într-un comunicat Liz Truss, ministrul de externe britanic. Potrivit autorilor studiului, ale căror nume nu au fost făcute publice din motive de securitate, agenții proruși recrutează troli pe Telegram, pe care îi plătesc pentru a răspândi propaganda pro-Kremlin. Campania rusă de dezinformare este foarte activă pe Facebook, YouTube, Instagram și TikTok. Ea este concepută cu scopul de a manipula opinia publică internațională, astfel încât să crească numărul celor care îl susțin pe Putin și războiul ilegitim al Rusiei împotriva Ucrainei. Cele mai întâlnite metode sunt falsificarea profilelor de pe rețelele de socializare ale unor importanți lideri sau personalități, atribuind acestora mesaje false. De asemenea, ei folosesc ID-uri false și creează zeci sau sute de pagini cu profiluri inexistente. O altă tehnică folosită de către troli este să ofere o vizibilitate mai mare postărilor făcute de către utilizatorii obișnuiți care se înscriu în linia Kremlinului. Ei reușesc să se sustragă măsurilor puse în aplicare de rețelele de socializare pentru a combate dezinformarea. De asemenea, trolii intră pe secțiunea de comentarii a cititorilor unor ziare sau site-uri de știri renumite și scriu zeci sau sute de mesaje. Acestea sunt postate imediat după publicarea unei știri sau a unui articol și primesc un număr neobișnuit de mare de aprecieri pe site-urile care le permit cititorilor să folosească opțiunile like sau dislike. Cititorul de bună credință nu va avea timp să răspundă genului acesta de mesaje, iar la un moment dat s-ar putea să nu mai poată discerne adevărul de minciună și să aibă îndoieli. În plus, postările acestor troli sunt preluate în mod selectiv de către media rusească și prezentate în mod manipulatoriu ca știri publicate de ziare sau site-uri prestigioase. Nu este pentru prima dată când se vorbește despre o așa numită fabrică de troli a Kremlinului. În aprilie 2015, The Guardian a scris un amplu articol despre o așa zisă armată de troli a lui Putin. Conform publicației, sute de bloggeri sunt plătiți să inunde forumurile și rețelele de socializare din Rusia și din străinătate cu mesaje împotriva vestului și comentarii favorabile Kremlinului. Trebuia să scriem postări obișnuite despre prăjituri și muzică, dar din când în când trebuia să aruncăm o postare politică despre cum guvernul de la Kiev este fascist sau lucruri asemănătoare, a explicat pentru The Guardian o blogăriță care a lucrat timp de 2 luni în centrul de troli și era plătită cu aproximativ $800 pe lună pentru a gestiona câteva conturi de pe site. Fabrica de troli din Sankt Petersburg nu este chiar așa un loc neștiut de nimeni, incognito și unde se lucrează pe ascuns. Clădirea este bine cunoscută, acolo lucrează non-stop sute de oameni foarte tineri, cu vârstă în jurul a 20 de ani, studenți care fie abia și-au terminat studiile, fie sunt pe final cu studiile masterale. Povestea jurnalista Ludmila Savciuc în 2018, într-un interviu acordat postului Radio Europa Liberă Moldova. Cunoscută pentru activismul său anti-Putin și a luptei împotriva propagandei, ea a reușit să se infiltreze și să lucreze o vreme la Agenția de Cercetare pentru Internet. Aceasta era denumirea oficială a fabricii de troli din oraș. Raportul publicat recent de guvernul britanic susține că în spatele manevrelor de dezinformare s-ar afla o grupare cunoscută pe Telegram sub numele de Cyberfront Z, cu sediul într-o fostă fabrică de arme situată în Sankt Petersburg. Aceasta ar avea legături cu Evgeni Prigojin, un magnat apropiat Kremlinului, acuzat de ingerință în alegerile prezidențiale americane din 2016. Cunoscut și ca bucătarul lui Putin, acesta este suspectat că ar finanța și compania de mercenari Wagner.
Atât pentru astăzi. Până miercurea viitoare, cu bine!